This year's event on media and misogyny as part of this year's Media Democracy Festival, organised by the Media Reform Coalition. The Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, researchers, and media practitioners to develop policies and campaigns for media reform in light of a communications environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organisations and is characterised by insufficient plurality, diversity, and accountability. I'll be the chair of your session today. My name is Hina Zumrad-Mutt, and I am an inclusion practitioner, director of Arts Festival, Banet, and I'm a researcher of internet coloniality at Goldsmiths, a topic which I explore in Passing Politics, a podcast that will be launched next month. So for this panel on media and misogyny, I'm joined by an amazing panel of speakers, each of whom is going to speak for around 8 to 10 minutes in the order that I'm going to introduce them. Then we'll come together for some discussion. So please do share your questions throughout on whichever comment platform that you're watching on, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. Now, I'll introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Sarah Banet-Weiser, who's Professor and Head of Communications at the London School of Economics. She's the author of a number of books across various topics, the most recent of which is Racism Post-Race, which was published in 2019. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
The next person we have is Samira Sablani, a journalist, writer, and analyst with a focus on East Africa. She has a weekly column in the Mail and Guardian's The Continent, and her work has been published in a range of publications, including Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and African Arguments. Hi, Samira.
How's it going?
And next we have Juliet Jacques, a writer, filmmaker, and academic based in London. Her next book, a volume of short stories entitled Variations, is published in June 2021. She hosts Suite 212 on Resonance 104.4 FM and teaches at the Royal College of Art and elsewhere. Hi, Juliet.
Hi.
So I'm really happy to see all of you. We're going to kick off with your introduction. So if I can hand over to you, Sarah.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Hannah, for introducing the panel, and thanks to Media Reform for having me, and a shout out to all the people who have made this really amazing conference possible. It's been great to watch. I was thinking about this talk a lot this week, and thinking that it's a pretty rough week in the UK, or rough couple of weeks in the UK, to talk about misogyny and the media. But I also think it's a really important time to talk about the connections between these two in light of what's been happening, not just in the UK, but all over the world. So I think that what I want to do is offer some sort of broad definitions of what I think media and misogyny are, and then the relationship between the two, and then give some examples of that as a way to kind of think through some of what we can do about misogyny. So I think first that one of the things that is important to me as a media scholar is to really think about what we mean when we say media. And I realize that a lot of people in this conference have been talking about journalism or mainstream media, from the mainstream news to tabloids, to magazine programming and so on. And there are certainly plenty of examples of misogyny in the mainstream media, and I will talk about some of them. But I also think that we need to think more broadly about what the media is as a structure, and include the different media platforms that are in so many ways dedicated to misogyny. The way to think about the way in which misogyny circulates and finds new connections in the media. So I think that when we're talking about what we mean when we say misogyny, it's clear that this current decade is one in which a networked digital misogyny has taken hold. Something that we could describe as like a basic anti-female violent expression that circulates to wide audiences and on many different popular media platforms. And the logics and the affordances of media platforms allow for an amplification of what the philosopher Kate Manne has described as the system that operates within a patriarchal social order to police and enforce women's subordination and to uphold male dominance. So it's about control, policing, and discipline. misogyny is one of the core elements in many different kind of oppressive movements that we see. The core, from racist movements to xenophobic to transphobic to anti-Semitic. Misogyny here is not an epiphenomenon, but it's rather a central strategy in these movements. And I think we need to recognize it as such. And one of the problems with it is it's often seen as sort of a side tactic rather than the central strategy. So the media is a dominant site for the expression of misogyny, although misogyny clearly exceeds the boundaries of media as well. Gendered representation in the media, regardless of platform, often relies on historical conventions, misogynistic conventions. So people who identify as men are represented as rational and honest and men of integrity, where women are often represented as hysterical or emotional and as liars. And these narratives or these scripts continue to shape and frame media representations of gender in the current moment. And they continue to be kind of scripts that many people live by. So in this moment that we're in right now, we also see there's more feminist protests, there's more feminist media productions, there's more recognition about gender inequalities, but we also see that misogyny is amped up. It is expressed more often and more normatively, and it is increasingly vicious and violent. And so when, thinking about what this ends up looking like, is that misogyny often relies on the idea that men have been injured by women. Men are victims of women, and especially of feminists, right? Men are seen to be denied rights because women have gained them. Men are no longer confident because women are too confident. Men have lost jobs and power because of women, not because of capitalism, because women have entered into previously male-dominated realms. So men's rights organizations and other forms of popular misogyny have dedicated themselves to kind of restoring the capacity of men, the recuperation of a traditional masculinity and a patriarchy itself. And so that's kind of what forms for me the core logic of what misogyny is. And if we think about misogyny as a main tactic in the mainstream and the extreme right media campaigns and media platforms, we can see that it is mobilized, misogyny is mobilized and weaponized against women as a way to secure or take back power. And we see this tragically all the time. Again, this is a rough week in the UK, and not only was, we witness to the murder of Sarah Everard and the fact that a policeman was charged with her murder, but women were arrested during a protest about violence towards women or doing a vigil for Sarah Everard. A few days earlier in Parliament on International Women's Day, the Labour MP Jess Phillips read out the names of the women who had been killed in the UK by male violence just since last year's International Women's Day. And it took her 4 minutes to read the list of over 100 women. Misogyny in the media has a vast reach, right? It targets female journalists. It frames stories about women in misogynistic ways. Within mainstream journalism, misogyny is frequently part of the sort of recent the current anti-journalism attacks on the press by conservative groups. Female media creators and journalists are often the target of those groups. So that means that we witness misogyny when the former president of the United States would routinely and publicly call female journalists stupid and losers in official press conferences. We witness this kind of misogyny against female journalists when they are doxxed and when they are targeted with rape threats and death threats and racism and other sorts of violence. You can see, there are many kind of highly visible female journalists who have experienced this and have talked about their experiences, such as Maria Resser, who founded the Manila-based news site, The Rappler, who has been the target of rape threats and death threats kind of relentlessly. In the past few years, we've seen this with the Guardian columnist Jessica Valenti, who's been a target of misogyny for years and actually had to take a break from the media because her 5-year-old daughter was threatened with death and rape. We've seen this very recently with the reporter, the New York Times reporter, Taylor Lorenz, who tweeted on International Women's Day that the barrage of misogyny that she's experienced this past year has destroyed her life. And these are just a few of the hundreds of female journalists who have been the target of misogyny. But you don't have to be a journalist in order to be the target of misogyny in the media. Women are visible in public spaces, who are visible in public spaces and who have powerful positions are almost always the target of misogyny at some point. And again, this is regardless of politics, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. One of the more striking cases for me was in July of this past year, when a male congressman in the United States accosted the female congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., when she was going in to vote, and called her disgusting, crazy, and finally he called her a fucking bitch. And this was in front of reporters, so it wasn't even seen as something that was, you know, out of the norm. So regardless of where you stand on politics, it's clear that powerful women are the targets of misogyny, from Kamala Harris to Theresa May. And it's hard, again, not to think about other powerful women or other women who have been in the press recently in the UK. The way in which the press continually framed and represented Meghan Markle, who was the target of both racism and misogyny. The fact that people called her a liar before the infamous Oprah interview even aired, with Piers Morgan saying publicly that he wouldn't believe her if she read the weather report. And the fact that these are privileged women, some more than others, doesn't negate the fact that the media attacks on them are often targeted towards them because they are women. And I think that we need to, you know, kind of remember that. And we also need to connect, misogyny of mainstream media to, again, a broader context of everyday networked misogyny that is expressed on multiple media platforms. So the emergence and the kind of heightened visibility of networked misogyny, often centered around spaces in online culture called the manosphere, they offer yet another plane in this kind of conjunctural logic of these mechanisms of controlling and disciplining women. And these attacks often focus on the bodies of women: racism, body shaming, fat shaming, slut shaming, threats of violent rape, threats of death. They're expressed in contemporary ways that, again, have been long part of our history. Women are seen as liars. They falsely accuse men of sexual violence. They manipulate in order to profit for themselves. And it just goes on and on and on. So, you know, one of the things that I was asked to do for this is to think about what we could do, right? A big question: what can we do about media and misogyny? And I think there's just a couple of things, and I'll just end with that. One is that we can actually recognize it as a relationship, right? That media and misogyny, they constitute each other in so many different ways. We can have a kind of moderate approach, and in terms of moderation, media companies can actually regulate misogyny as something to block, something to not allow on platforms. But I think more generally, we need to think about misogyny as a structure, as a structuring force, that we need to refuse to normalize it as jokes, as locker talk, as, you know, yet another occasion of boys being boys. You know, I know that for some people, it's absolutely necessary for self-preservation to turn off the comments, to refuse to engage, or to refuse to read the violence that is targeted at them. And I completely get that. People are told not to overreact because the media is not real life. Except it is, right? And we know that the borders of online and offline lives are increasingly blurry. And I think we need to make this explicit. Rape threats are not simply, as the journalist Glenn Greenwald said a few days ago, they're not simply mean tweets, right? It is something that structures the everyday life of women. So I think that we need to think of misogyny as beyond individuals and beyond individual expressions in the media. It is a social harm. It is a public health crisis. It is a system of violence, and we need to recognize it as such. You know, and in the United States, there are more mass shootings than any other country in the world, and the majority of them are not only committed by men, but against women. And this happens in the kind of increasing misogyny that is visible online. Not a causal connection, but I think we need to think of this as a structuring force, as a conjuncture. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that really excellent introduction, which I think touches on so many different areas of this huge topic. When we're thinking about, for example, the technical side, when we're thinking about the platforms that you mentioned there, but then also the representations that we see of women and how those are also tinged by misogyny. So thanks again for that. We'll now go on to Samira Savlani, who will introduce.
Hi, thank you for having me. So listening to Sarah, a few things have kind of come to mind. And for me, the most important thing I think we always need to remember is the media does not exist in a vacuum. The media directly contributes to the way we see the world, the way we interact with each other. And that really, for me, forms the crux of why misogyny in and by the media contributes so much to what we see taking place around us. So if we look at the last week in the UK, it was I think, if we put it as we started with International Women's Day and we ended with Mother's Day. And in between that week, the kind of misogyny we saw in between 2 days where we are supposedly celebrating women, to me, says everything about how ceremonial as a society we can be. And my work involves me looking at media around the world, be it the African continent, be it in other countries. And the one common thread that I have seen is misogyny is a running theme. You will hear of a case of someone being raped in Kenya, and you will see the headline actively blaming the victim, and it's no different here, it's no different in the States. And so I think we are dealing with a global problem. Alongside that, it's also interesting to see, Sarah mentioned, the Meghan Markles, the privileged women, and how ultimately your privilege can only protect you to an extent from that misogyny. Once more, my work has shown me that regardless of your status, regardless of whether you're famous or not, the fact that you are a woman means you will be the victim of misogyny as a result of the media. And I think for me, looking at pop culture, for example, if we start with pop culture, we look at someone like Serena Williams, who's been the victim of misogynoir, the way her body has been talked about, the way she has been talked about. Interestingly, she is depicted in a cartoon as throwing a tantrum during a tennis tournament, and a white tennis woman player recently did throw a tantrum, and nothing was said about it. So you see that in something like sports. You see Meghan Markle, we've already talked about that. And so, media putting out even the coverage of her in terms of, we are not going to believe her, she is lying, she stole Harry, this kind of vixen thing. And I think that historically the way women have been represented in the media is vixen, virago, and that still is reinforced now. And then if you take, you go away from pop culture and you look at world leaders. So a lot of my work covers politics, and anytime is a woman president or a woman, cabinet secretary, the coverage is always different. The coverage is always, I think it was possibly the Daily Mail that had that. I mean, it could have been one of the other papers actually, that had an image of Angela Merkel and Theresa May on the front. And there was comments about their legs. There were comments about their outfits. We never hear that about the men. No one ever sees, President Biden or Boris Johnson as, oh, who wore it best? Yet when it comes to women leaders, we always see it. So it's also a case of realizing that nothing can protect you, whether you're in politics, whether you're a pop star, whether you're a tennis player, or whether you're just, a woman trying to get home and walking in the dark on your own, and something happens, you will still be a victim of that misogyny. I think that really is a global experience for women. And that's why, for me, it's important to acknowledge that this is not just a problem in the UK media, or this is a global thing. And we've seen it, for example, in India, where there's an Indian journalist called Rana Ayub, and she has spoken out a lot about the policies being enacted by the government towards Muslims, and the kind of misogyny she comes up against is, I think what happens with women, and I've experienced this as a women journalist myself, is the criticism you get is never just about what you've said. If someone does not agree with you, it will never just be, we don't agree with you. It is always, they will always make some kind of comment regarding you being a woman. That is the kind, I've had experiences where I've shared something about something taking place in a political situation, and I've had a man respond to me and say, well, what's your body count? Or, kind of very sexual comments, something men don't have to deal with. And all of this, for me, comes as a result of what we see on TV, in the newspapers, and now with social media. Even if you look historically, I've been listening to podcasts, historical podcasts, and you look at the way women have been depicted over centuries now, Anne Boleyn or Lucrezia Borgia, like this kind of sexy women that are responsible for all the wicked and evil in the world. And I don't think that that's particularly changed even in this day and age. I think we still see women as everything to blame, and we still, as a media, I think the media goes out of its way to keep women under control, and that goes across the board, from your Kim Kardashians to your everyday women, where anytime you are seen as slightly going out of line, there will be some kind of attack from the media to put you in your place again. And where I think it's becoming increasingly problematic is social media has broadened their voices. So there was a case recently, and the BBC put a headline about a girl headbutting a man who tried to attack her. And you see the headline and you think to yourself, shouldn't the headline be about what he's done? Not about her headbutting him. Let's focus on him. But these are things that I think we see time and time again. And unfortunately, it doesn't, you kind of think to yourself, maybe if we have more women in the media, that will change. I'm not sure that has necessarily taken place. I think we are still seeing the same headlines repeated, the same coverage repeated, because the decision makers are mainly men. And so I think that there is something in that. And I also think that there's a very casual dismissal of what the media say. The Sun's page 3 situation, it's not, that should have been gone ages ago, but it took so long. And I think it's because misogyny in the media is very accepted. I don't think that people see it to be the problem that it is. And the reason I think one of the contributing factors is I don't think people are making the connection between the media and real life. Like, these are real things. The victim blaming that we have seen in the last week comes directly from the media. That can't, in my opinion, that can't be dismissed. We have this obsession going where the woman is always responsible. And I will finish on this. There was a journalist in Australia who did an article looking at the coverage of women who were murdered, who were sex workers, or, who didn't fall into the perfect victim. And I think that, and she showed how little coverage there was for these women and their murders. And I think that says everything about how the media contribute to the way in which women are portrayed, and who is a good woman and who is a bad woman, and what woman went out of her way to be harmed. And there is never accuracy or balance, or at least it's very rare. We still have this obsession on protect the men, and that's because it's a system. So yeah, that's my take.
Thanks so much, Samira. You touched on so many topics there, but I think what you really flagged there for me is this idea that it is a global problem, and the headlines that you see in one country, you could easily just translate them and put them in a different country and they would not be out of place. So it's not just the misogyny that's a global issue, but it's also these scripts that Sarah introduced to us that you see coming about time and time again in different cultures and societies. So thanks again. And now we'll move on to Juliet Jacques. So I'll hand over to you, Juliet.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was just on mute there. So I want to add to this by talking about, I guess, my area of expertise, which is what the American writer Julia Serrano calls transmisogyny, which is the hatred of trans women in particular. And I think this should be a concern for everyone watching, because you know, what a lot of transphobia touches on is a loathing of femininity. I think homophobia, sexism, and transphobia all have misogyny at their root. And there are interesting issues around bodily autonomy and personal freedom to consider here. So I'd like to talk about this issue from that perspective. And I think it's especially notable that a lot of media discourse around trans people and non-binary people does focus quite strongly on trans women. It ignores trans men to quite a large extent. I mean, on a more general level, you do see a lot of concern for trans children and a lot of discussion around hormone blockers for trans children, which is cast as often using very emotive terms such as child abuse. You know, this is something that is regulated through a medical process and parental consent. And also the idea behind hormone blockers is that they just delay the onset of puberty. So you often see this not represented particularly accurately in the media. And you also see something like, you know, newly discovered concerns about the integrity of women's sports, which in football in particular were often an object of mockery until quite recently. And to some extent, this relies on the preconception that cisgender women are, you know, inherently physically inferior to men or people born male, or to trans women. So I think there's actually quite an interesting relationship between sexism and transphobia there as well. Transphobia in the tabloids and the broadsheets goes back really as far as the emergence of trans people ourselves in the early to mid 20th century. In mid 20th century coverage of transsexual women in particular, you see this kind of lurid obsession with former names, former professions, these kind of before and after photos that you would often see, for example, when the American trans woman Christine Jorgensen became a global celebrity in the early 1950s. This obsession with the kind of before and after appearance on the front page of national and international newspapers was very, very present, has never really gone away. In 2012, the group Transmedia Watch presented to the Leveson Inquiry about denigration of trans people as a group and of specific media malpractice around trans people in particular, like the outing of trans people with photographs and other identifying information, obviously with old names or dead names, and old photographs as well, published without the individual's consent. And Leveson summed up by saying that the media's harassment of trans people and treatment of trans and non-binary people as a group was unacceptable. I think I probably won't be alone here in saying that it's disappointing how little impact the Leveson Inquiry has had on our media culture as a whole. In some ways, it has maybe led to the media doubling down and getting worse. But there are different types of transphobia and transmisogyny present across different media sectors. The tabloids tend to focus on the cost of treatment to taxpayers on the NHS. Again, these figures are often not very reliable. Transmedia Watch did put out more accurate figures, but this is one of the things I think the tabloids feel able to lie about with impunity. often kind of portray trans women in particular as deceptive and as inherently criminal, and really talk a lot about issues around prisons and where trans people sit in the prison system. And this has been an ongoing issue, but I think the worst thing the media have done was make up a story that Ian Huntley, who had been imprisoned for killing two 10-year-old girls in 2002 in a very high-profile case, was transitioning in prison at the taxpayer's expense, which kind of taps into all the tropes I've just mentioned. This turned out not to be true. It was based on one very flimsy bit of testimony from a fellow inmate at the high security prison that Huntley was at. The story unraveled, and the papers who had published on it either very quietly apologized for publishing it, or more often just kind of took the stories off their websites and just quietly stopped mentioning it. There's also been a tendency in those cases to cast trans people as inherently predatory or a threat to children. This really draws on a lot of homophobic stereotypes and prejudices that anyone who followed the kind of media moral panic around gay people in the 1980s will certainly recognize. Indeed, you know, it's become quite commonplace for people to say that the treatment of trans people, non-binary people in the media now is very similar to gay people in the 1980s, which led to Section 28. So for one example, the Mail journalist Richard Littlejohn wrote more than one piece about a trans teacher in Accrington called Lucy Meadows in 2013, about her teaching at a primary school in Accrington. Meadows subsequently took her own life, and at the inquest, the coroner said that while you can't blame the press coverage, it certainly didn't help. The broadsheet approach is slightly different. You'll see someone like The Times who run numerous anti-trans opinion pieces written by like cisgender men and women. It's a mixture of this kind of conservative opposition to just attacks on traditional gender roles that they see trans and non-binary people as literally embodying, and a certain strand of feminist position that expresses concern about male infiltration of women's spaces and appropriation of bodies. And these lines of transphobia have adopted a similar tactic to a lot of the alt-right in the US, which is to embed themselves through constant insistence on being debated. So this insistence on debate doesn't really ask this question about who's setting the terms, whether the terms are fair. And this really happened in response to a rise in trans and non-binary visibility in mainstream media in the early 2010s, which was often imperfect, but did allow a lot more trans and non-binary people, myself included, to articulate the realities of trans and non-binary living in a way that hadn't really been allowed before. And to try and shift the sort of conversation onto issues around social security, housing, mental and physical health and healthcare, employment and discrimination law, and so on. And what this sort of insistence on debating the validity of trans and non-binary identities does is basically just pin us back onto hostile territory, force us to sort of constantly defend our own existences, often on the harshest possible terms. I mean, I think probably the most dispiriting example of this was the genderquake debate that Channel 4 put on in 2018, which sort of culminated in a group of people in the front row of the audience just literally yelling the word penis at one of the trans women on the panel. I don't really know, I was actually approached to be on this show, and I was told it would be an intelligent and sensitive dinner party style debate. And I don't know what kind of dinner parties these people are hosting, but I don't want to go to them, and I guess you probably don't either. So one of the key tactics here is to separate kind of normal, quote unquote, trans people from activists. And of course, an activist is anyone who speaks out against transphobia, and is characterized as being kind of nasty and bullying and indeed misogynist, and offering any criticism of those tactics just kind of proves their point. It's a kind of double bind, it's a self-reinforcing logic, but it's not just in the media, it feeds into government policy, whether it's Donald Trump in the US talking about mandating trans people out of existence, or Liz Truss here leaking proposals to the Times last summer, suggesting that not only would proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier for trans and non-binary people to define their own identities and consequently access healthcare and gender recognition more easily, not only would those reforms not be made despite public consultation in England, Wales and Scotland coming back in favour of them, but laws would possibly be passed to allow people more easily to keep trans and non-binary people out of single-sex spaces, so essentially make it impossible for trans and non-binary people to use public toilets, for example, and thus trying to kind of bar us from public life. This wasn't implemented, but of course it introduced as a threat against trans people, and I think in part to make the rather compromised Gender Recognition Act reforms they eventually passed look better than they otherwise were. So over the last decade, a lot of trans and non-binary people have tried going through mainstream media and have found some representation in places like Dazed or Vice, or indeed series on Netflix, or in places like Vogue. Mainstream politics media has ended up being quite resistant to us, I think. And I think a better tactic for us is to build up our own media, especially media run by like younger people and people on the left who are quite explicitly trans inclusive. So whether that's Galdem, of course, like run for like women and trans and non-binary people of color, New Socialist, or Tribune magazine, whose editors have been very upfront about being trans inclusive, and indeed have published some quote unquote gender critical content, but have always been very careful to make explicit that the magazine is trans inclusive and has trans and non-binary writers and wants us to be a part of the project. I mean, I think stated editorial commitments to trans rights are useful as well, as are supportive cisgender journalists. In a recent piece I wrote, I singled out Owen Jones and Ellie Mae O'Hagan as like people who aren't trans but who have consistently stood up for trans rights and been critical of their colleagues in the industry when they've displayed any sort of trans misogyny. But like I said, I think rather than just talking about freedom of speech per se, I think a useful thing to do is consider the terms of debate and who sets them. And I don't think that's just useful for trans people. Obviously, our two previous speakers have talked about that, but also giving trans and non-binary people a space to write about other things, just rather than just purely their gender identities, can also lead to a sort of more sophisticated, more nuanced conversation, and might help to get like trans and non-binary people into editorial positions. And so you can have a rather different attitude to those terms of discussion that I've been talking about. So yeah, I'm going to conclude there.
Thank you so much, Juliet. A lot for us to think about there as well. Thinking about those broadsheet pieces that you're talking about and how they're often, commission these think pieces with the idea being that we're having a reasonable debate, but it also means that you're pausing the conversation always at a point of defending, as you say, trans people and non-binary people's existences. And so there's never any kind of progression in the conversation, even though we really want to be able to move on and discuss other things and allow these groups to talk about other things as well. Now, one theme that I've noticed has kind of come across everyone's introductions, and thank you for these, because they all come from a very different perspective, which is great that you were able to share them. But kind of my area, which is more around kind of tech, and looking at the media platforms that we all have come to rely on and use, and the way in which misogyny is kind of hard coded in effectively into all of them. I think about Twitter and how it's consistently not dealt with the issue of harassment of women and queer people on that platform, And if it had been designed, we always say if it had been designed by women, or if it had designed by queer or trans people to start with, then these considerations would have been at the heart of the platform. We would have thought about how to protect ourselves on there. I think also about Facebook and its real name policy, which it is discriminatory against trans people who may have lived by different names, and that is a state of survival for them, and their account can be weaponized against them by anyone if they complain and say that is not the person's so-called real name. And then I also think about the case of Ron, which Samira brought up, who actually suffered doxing, and also another weapon that's been brought up against women, particularly who are in the public eye, is deep fake online sexual abuse, sometimes referred to as so-called revenge porn. This kind of imagery is only going to become more and more widespread, and women who choose to kind of put themselves in the public eye are facing more and more of these very, very real threats to their well-being, to their mental health, to their families and relationships. So I just kind of wanted to open that up for discussion, and that brings me to one of the questions actually that somebody shared earlier on in the discussion, which I'd like to put to you all now, which is, and it reflects what someone actually brought up about Glenn Greenwald, which is, if a woman chooses to be in the public eye and chooses to be, for example, a journalist speaking out, this question that has come forward is, where do we draw the line between people realistically kind of responding and maybe disagreeing with the perspectives that they're sharing as a journalist or a media professional, and where do we draw the line between that and kind of trolling or harassment or misogyny?
Should we just...
Sorry, do you want to come in on that? Yes, please.
Sure, I can. I mean, I think that the question, I think that something that all of us have talked about is the fact that that misogyny is sort of seen as kind of, it's naturalized as just the way we should just expect it, right? And the fact that female journalists are victims of misogyny does not negate the fact that journalists themselves are being attacked in the current moment. But it's kind of always framed in this sort of, or often framed in a zero-sum game. So that, the Taylor Lorenz, which I think was the topic of the question, and Glenn Greenwald, who, when he says, well, she's in the public eye, so she should be ready for this. I mean, being in the public eye, should we be ready for like constant rape threats? I mean, I'm just kind of confused as to why that means, because we're visible or because people are visible, that means that this kind of vitriol and violence can be directed to us as women, right? And I think we need to be specific about that, to be, to say that it's that there are lots and lots of kind of abuse. But misogyny is often, again, dismissed as something that is just like, naturalized or an epiphenomenon. And I think we need to think about it as a core strategy that works, or that intends to discipline and police women because they are women. And once we start kind of being specific about that, then I think we can actually address it as a structural problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sad to say, you even see that in progressive circles. For example, if someone doesn't agree with someone's politics, and I take the example of Preeti Patel, whose politics we can all agree, or maybe we can all agree are, reprehensible. But what we can't do is resort to racialized misogyny against someone because she's in the public eye. We can disagree with these people on the basis of politics, or disagreeing with their views and their behaviors, rather than it being reduced into that way.
I remember Diane Abbott saying, she was talking about the kind of hate mail she receives, and she said, when you go through it, it's so obvious that a lot of it is gender-based and a lot of it is race-based, because there's stuff about rape, there's stuff about my appearance, and that kind of those words, that attitude would not be something that a man would experience. So I think it really does come down to, people are welcome to disagree with you, but all too often it's, as a woman, at least as what I've experienced, is the response is never, I just disagree with you. The response will always have some kind of sexual element to it, or the rape threats, or the dick pics, or any of these things. You know, putting yourself out in the public eye and having an opinion is not an invitation to people to come at you with very gendered abuse. Like, that is not, you know, if a man comes out with an opinion, it's very rare for people to respond to a man in the same way that they would to a woman. And I think Preeti Patel is an example of that. She is problematic, you know, but when it turns into how she looks or her heritage or her being a woman, you know, misogynistic commentary, that's where we're way off the mark, because also what we're doing is we are taking attention away from her very problematic policies. And that in itself changes the discussion then.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. I don't have anything to add.
So thank you for those contributions. Another question that we have is from Simone. Would you say that women who help to push these misogynist messages are more successful in the media? So the person has suggested it's Katie Hopkins or Susanna Reid, who's been putting up or been complacent with Piers Morgan and his ongoing misogyny. How do you feel about that? Again, we can start with Sarah.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think that we often approach this, you know, in a sort of a binary sense, and so it's easy to sort of assume that women can't be misogynist, and I think women can be misogynist. That it's a system, and you know how you occupy your position within that system means that, you know, women, you know, are often kind of even strategically positioned as the, you know, as the voice, the misogynistic voice against all the women who are complaining about this, right? So do they have, is the question, do they have more visibility? It depends on the media platform, right? I mean, if it's a media platform like Piers Morgan's platform, I mean, it makes sense to have a co-host that would be kind of engage in some sort of polite banter, but actually not challenge the deep misogynistic kind of expressions that he continually spouses. And so this is also relates to another question about, you know, kind of the relationship between who gets to be visible and who is rendered invisible because of that visibility. And so I think we need to think about it in those terms as well as when we're thinking about these, you know, sort of conservative women benefiting from misogyny.
I think internalized misogyny is a real problem, and where I think we as women, or at least I can speak for myself, is, you know, there's also this thing of the sisterhood, and we all have to stick together, and sometimes that can stop you from calling out problematic women, or women who behave in a problematic way in terms of, you know, I think sometimes silence is complicity, and I've definitely seen a lot of commentary this week, in the last few weeks on social media, about Susanna Reid being accused of being silent, and then other people have said, oh, but you know, you'll see her kind of roll her eyes, and then I've had other people say, you know, she is also trying to survive a system which is misogynistic. But in my opinion, you speak out. You know, I don't think that there is an excuse to not speak out, and maybe that's too big a blanket statement, and you know, I'm willing to take the hit on that. But I think that in a situation where a man is on breakfast TV accusing a woman of color, of lying about her mental health, and that's just, you know, that's just the tiny part of the kind of things that Piers Morgan has been seen to say over the years. I do feel like you have to get to a point where you do have to speak out. Susanna Reid has her own Twitter account, for example. Unfortunately, sometimes I think we have to accept that internalized misogyny plays out in many different ways. Maybe sometimes people don't even know they're doing it. So I'm not trying to throw accusations at someone, but I think it's a problem. And in terms of Katie Hopkins, I still don't even know what to call that. I don't know what's going on there. Do I think she got away with more because she's a woman? I think we can't divorce that from a race thing. I think that she benefits from white privilege and being a white woman, which is why she could get away with whatever she does get away with.
Yeah, and I think I would kind of add that I personally have come to feel over the last decade or so that the British media really rewards people from minorities, whether that's like cis women, trans people, gay men, queer people, people of color. The media really rewards people, and right-wing politics really rewards people who at best aren't prepared to make any structural critique of societal prejudice, or at worst are actively deny that it exists. And it's a kind of politics of representation, right? And I mean, we talked about how, for example, with Priti Patel, focus can end up being put onto her kind of background at the expense of talking about her policies. And, you know, there's sort of bad faith use of identity politics working in this, a kind of negative identity politics, which is like we have representation in government for like a woman of color. So you can't complain when she puts through incredibly draconian and like racist policies, you know. And so I do think that, yes, there's a way in which identity politics discourses have been appropriated by the right in order to reward people who are willing to pursue right-wing policy agendas. Yeah.
Yeah. Hannah, you're muted. Yeah.
Had to make that mistake at least once during this. Thank you, everyone. So we have a question here that says, we've heard quite a lot about media misogyny directed towards women who are already in the public eye. And the person wants us to talk a little bit about the kind of more generalized misogyny directed at ordinary women. So, for example, they suggested single mothers or sex workers and how that works. And they also draw attention to the kind of hypervisibility of some women and then the invisibility of others. And they give the example of the women that were murdered at the tail end of last year, two black women, Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman in London. So yeah, for that one, do you want to kick off, Samira?
Oh gosh, yeah. So for me, you know, I'm going to move away from the media as newspapers and stuff, and I'm going to go into TV, film, and the way in which women are portrayed, and then how that. So if we take single mothers, for example, I think we can agree that, you know, over the years, the way your soap opera films and everything put a particular portrayal of single mums, which is negative, which is not, you know, and I think class comes into that a lot. And that then influences the way society as a whole looks at single mothers, for example. Same thing with sex workers. You know, there is, I think the portrayal of sex workers across the media, from, you know, biblical times to film, TV, is women without agency. I don't even think that, more often than not, I don't even think they're portrayed as just women. And I feel that that's really how, that for me is the main way in which we see your everyday women and their various identities portrayed in the media, mainly through things like TV shows and films, and then that contributes to our opinion on their worth almost. And in the cases of the murders, you know, again, I don't want to take, you know, any woman who is a victim of violence is, you know, there's an even keel there. But I do want to go back to what I mentioned earlier, that there is a tendency that we do see in our media where some women are given more coverage than others. I don't think that can really be denied. I'm going to have to apologize that I've forgotten the name, but in the last since the case of Sarah Everard, there's been a mention of a young Black woman who was also found murdered, and nothing's been done. I think her name may have been Blessing, but I could be, I could be wrong. And I think that it comes back to what we see as victim. Why is it that often when women of color, I think trans women, we hear about it, particularly in the States, you'll hear about a trans woman being murdered, and it's something that comes up on Twitter, not on the front page of a newspaper. That there is a problem there. Something is wrong there. And I think intersectionality comes into that, as does the various, racism, transphobia, all these elements play into why we hear more about certain victims than we don't others.
Thanks, Samira. Juliet, did you want to come in on that?
I mean, yeah, obviously I again agree with pretty much all of that, and yeah, the media campaign against single mothers has been consistent throughout my lifetime. Something I remember very, very strongly growing up in the 90s. Yeah, I mean, sex workers certainly treated with like appalling misogyny and, the sort of sexism and misogyny that lies behind a lot of media coverage of women and women's sexuality, I think, is often particularly pronounced in the case of any coverage of sex workers. There's an awful lot to say about that, and I don't think I've really got a lot of time. So maybe I'll just hand over to Sarah and see if there's anything she wants to add.
Yeah, I also agree with everything that has been said. I mean, I think that, part of the question is what about ordinary women? And I think that it is true that particular women, especially if you happen to be a white celebrity, have a platform to talk about this kind of misogyny being directed at them, which as we've all said, doesn't negate the fact that it's misogyny, but it does ask us to think about who gets to be visible, who gets to be valued as a body, and who isn't, and how that works as a dynamic. And I will say that and I probably have the percentage wrong too, but just this last week, I think the UN Women UK came out with a statistic that's something astronomically high, like 95% of women in the UK, 18 to 34, have experienced some sort of harassment, sexual harassment. I mean, this is not something that only happens in these very visible ways. It happens with gender, it's manifest in gender pay gaps, it's manifest in hiring practices and housing practices and the discrimination against sex workers and single mothers. And so what Samira was talking about in terms of the representation in the media of these different kinds of groups, we can also see manifest in everyday life and just practices that we sort of tragically just become used to, and I think that ordinariness of misogyny is something that we really have to confront.
Thank you all. This has been such a wide-ranging discussion. I think the key thing that's come out to me just before I close is that you've really drawn a picture of how everything is so interconnected and interwoven. And in order to tackle something which is so kind of interconnected, we do need to view it in that way and continue to make it visible in that way. It's present in so many different discussions. It's not, one particular group of women that are suffering this. It's across all these different intersections. So again, I thank you so much for this. And as I draw the panel to a close, I'd also like to just mention the Media Reform Coalition is a voluntary organisation that survives mostly on air and some kind donors. For these debates, we would like to acknowledge the support of Byline Times, the Independent Media Association, the Canary, Squawk Box, BioWire News, Manchester Meteor. If you'd like to support the work of the Media Reform Coalition, then please follow the links on the closing slide. Thank you so much for joining today, and thank you for your questions as well. Goodbye.